Listen, just one more thing.
Hello there. Welcome to my review of episode 2 of season 4 of Columbo, Negative Reaction. First broadcast on the 15th of October, 1974 on NBC. It was written by Peter S. Fisher and directed by Alf Schelling, both returning to Columbo. The episode begins with a shot of a photo coming slowly into focus as it develops in a dark room. As the camera pans out, it reveals a man pasting together a ransom note out of newspaper letters. This is very similar to how the episode Short Fuse begins. A photographer in his dark room planning out his murder. I wonder what the makers of the show had against photographers. The man is Paul Galesko, played by Dick Van Dyke. Van Dyke was born Richard Wayne Van Dyke on the 13th of December 1925 in Missouri, and decided to become an entertainer after attending drama class in high school. Denied the opportunity to enlist in 1944 due to being underweight, he was eventually accepted as a radio announcer and troupe entertainer in the continental US. He began his civilian career as a radio DJ before forming a mime duo with Phil Erickson. He appeared on stage and on television, including on the Phil Silvers Show in 2 different roles. He would later be cast as the lead on the Dick Van Dyke Show, which rocketed him to fame, winning 3 Emmys for his performance in the process, and making him a household name. He would also become a film star shortly after this, Bert in Mary Poppins and Caractacus Potts in Chitty Chitty Bang Bang being 2 of his biggest roles, but also appearing in many other films. He would continue to work in film and television in large and small roles, including starring in his own murder mystery show Diagnosis Murder as Dr. Mark Sloan, along with his son Barry, for 8 years, which would feature many of his performing family in guest roles, as well as other stars of classic film and television. He would also appear in 2 of the 3 Night at the Museum films. He continues to work to this day in occasional film and television appearances, most recently Mary Poppins Returns, and with his a cappella group, The Fantastics. He is 96. Galesko's wife angrily berates him through the door for taking so long, and he urges her not to enter, claiming to be developing photos. In the next scene, she continues to berate him, mostly for thinking of buying a ranch house which he wants her to come and view. He's clearly angry with her. This is not a happy marriage. It's a wonderful opening which, with very little, tells us all we need to know about these 2 characters' relationships to each other. Within a couple of minutes, we know exactly what his motive is, and we're also getting an idea of where he intends to murder his hen-pecking, heavy-drinking spouse. He takes her to the ranch house, and she predictably hates it. He plugs in an electric clock, which he's set to the wrong time, then grabs her and ties her up. She continues to berate him while all this is going on and thinks he's playing some sort of bad practical joke as he takes her picture tied to the chair. She does admit to being scared, and he reveals that he's sick of being a constant disappointment to her.
I have this dream, Francis. I'm working, and there's a phone call, and he says, "Terribly sorry, Mr. Galesko, but your wife's dead." And then I always wake up, and I want to cry, because you're still alive. And I have nothing to face that day but another 24 hours with a domineering, nagging, suffocating woman who took all the joy out of my life.
He then takes out a gun and shoots her, but not before admitting it's almost worth getting caught to be rid of her for good.
You'll never get away with it.
And if not, it's a chance I'm going to take.
He resets the clock to the right time, then goes to a public phone booth and calls his photography studio to say he's not going to be in, and tells his assistant that they will be taking a trip to the Philippines together. The assistant his wife was convinced he was having an affair with. He then checks the time with the garage attendant where he's making the call from to cement his alibi, and goes to meet his patsy, an ex-con called Alvin Deschler, played by Don Gordon. Gillespie has convinced Alvin to act as if he's the one interested in the ranch for tax purposes, and has instructed him to buy a car and a specific camera. Then broken into Alvin's motel room and stolen the camera, which is what he used to photograph his wife. He then arranges to meet Alvin the next day at a disused junkyard. The next morning at home he tells his housekeeper that Mrs. Gillespie has gone away. The housekeeper's slightly concerned by how he's behaving, but then the phone rings. It's Alvin asking when he wants to meet Gillespie, but Gillespie acts as if it's the kidnappers, and without giving anything away to Alvin, he ends the call, but acts as if the kidnappers are still on the line for the benefit of the housekeeper. He tells her specifically not to ask any questions and hurriedly leaves, leaving behind a tantalizing note that says $20,000 in small bills. He then goes to see his friend Ray to borrow the money and make sure that Ray knows about the kidnapping. He takes the money to Alvin's motel room, along with the newspapers, paste and scissors he used to make the ransom note, and the camera he stole from Alvin, but not the murder weapon, which he takes with him to the junkyard. He meets with Alvin and gets him to hold the ransom note and the photograph he took, under the pretense of merely showing him what's going on. He then shoots Alvin with a different gun, placing his wife's murder weapon in Alvin's dead hand and then shooting himself in the leg. As he limps back to his car, he's spotted by a tramp living at the junkyard, played by returning Columbo cameo star Vito Scotti, who heard the shots but apparently didn't see anything. This is a fairly long and complex setting up of the alibi, which time spent is well earned thanks to the quick establishing of the motive. We see Gillespie go through every part of his plan, so can we see where he's gone wrong and how Columbo is going to catch him out. Well, no, the first time I watched this I didn't have a clue how he'd end up getting Gillespie. It's a lot of fun to see so much of the episode set up like this, dangling all the information that Columbo will have to go on in front of us. We cut to the police on the scene and we are treated to another uniformed cop not realising Columbo is a detective as he pulls up in his car, which the cop understandably thinks he's looking to scrap. Columbo speaks with one of his sergeants and the sergeant thinks it happened exactly as the murderer wanted, which is not unusual for a Columbo episode. But the tramp is there and says he heard everything. Is the time between the shots being fired going to be what catches Gillespie out? Columbo visits Gillespie at the hospital where his gunshot wound is being stitched. He says he's sure his wife is dead and Columbo tries to reassure him. Columbo also notices the powder burns on Gillespie's trousers. He now knows, or at the very least suspects, that Gillespie is the one behind the whole thing. Gillespie tells his version of what just happened, and just as he finishes, a uniformed cop tells Columbo they've got into Alvin's motel room, and Columbo goes to the scene. At the scene, the motel manager tells Columbo Alvin had told him that the camera was missing. The sergeant assumes that he was lying, but Columbo isn't so sure. It seems like an odd thing to lie about. They then check the phone records for Alvin's room, showing that he made the call to Gillespie that we know he made. It would seem as if Gillespie has covered all his bases. But after checking Alvin's arrest record, Columbo thinks Alvin is too smart to have left so much evidence around the room. He then gets the news Mrs. Gillespie's body has been found. It's interesting to see an episode get so far in and have the alibi still hold up as well as this. Columbo has his doubts, but nothing that would make him certain that Gillespie is behind the whole thing. Columbo goes to the ranch and Gillespie arrives pretending to be shocked and grief-stricken and accompanies the body to the morgue. Inside, the real estate agent selling the ranch, played by a young-ish John Ashton, best known for playing Taggart in Beverly Hills Cop 1 and 2, identifies Alvin as the man who put the offer in for the ranch. It's also only his prints at the scene. Columbo spots the clock and notices there's no dust on it, and finds more photos of Mrs. Gillespie in the fireplace. Suspicions are now starting to build. He then goes to find the tramp at a homeless mission, and is mistaken by a nun, played by Joyce Van Patten, for one of the tramps, and offers him a newer coat and some food.
You're hungry and tired, I can see that.
Well, the fact is I didn't sleep last night and I'm plenty tired.
Oh, I am
Thank you.
sorry. Would you wait here?
Before he can argue, he's sat down eating. This is a very funny scene, played perfectly with Columbo's reputation for scruffiness. But he then spots the tramp from the junkyard, Thomas Dolan, to check his statement about the gap between the shots, before he's interrupted by the nun again with a new coat, and he's finally able to explain, although she thinks he's an undercover cop posing as a tramp, which is a pretty good punchline. Unfortunately for Columbo, Dolan doesn't remember a single thing about the statement he gave or what he saw, leading to another dead end. Columbo meets Gillespie at his home, and Falk does a funny bit of business with his cigar ashes that doesn't really work in the context of the scene. It would have been better had it not followed a comedy scene. There's not much breathing room, so the bit of physical comedy he does doesn't quite land. It makes it feel like there was potentially a bridging scene cut out. Columbo then turns on the charm with Gillespie, so that we pretty much have confirmation now that he knows that Gillespie is the one who did it. He solicits some photography expertise out of Gillespie. Columbo then confronts him about the gap between the shots and the powder burns on his trousers, which Gillespie tries to explain away and does a pretty good job of it. Columbo then goes to the camera shop where Alvin bought the camera and confirms that fact, but also finds out that he told the clerk to make the receipt out for $80 more than it cost, and he took a cab to the shop. This is the second time. It appears that he had some sort of expense account. The next scene is at Mrs. Gillespie's funeral, where Columbo is taking photos, trying to be surreptitious and failing. This scene doesn't quite work for me. Columbo attempts to be underestimated by others, not flat out rude. It's not a social occasion where he might commit an etiquette faux pas. It's a funeral where he would know exactly how to behave, and this would have some sort of an impact on the other mourners, which is perhaps too much of a price to pay in order to trick your villain into revealing something. He explains to Gillespie that he wanted pictures of the mourners in order to identify Alvin's accomplice. Gillespie is shocked by this and tells him there was no accomplice. Well, I'm not sure, I believe Columbo would intrude on Heather Mourner's grief just to drop this information on Gillespie. His just one more thing is that Gillespie was late for his meeting with the supposed kidnapper. Gillespie explains that he was told to go to a phone booth first, and he remembers which phone booth, which Columbo finds curious, as he does that Gillespie wrote down the amount of the ransom, but not the location of the phone booth that he was supposed to go to. Gillespie's excuse is that he was in a state of confusion. Back at the evidence lockup, Columbo wants to see Alvin's possessions and bumps into the captain, who says it's an open and shut case. He thinks Columbo is wasting his time, but Columbo can't understand why Alvin planned and carried out the kidnapping the way he did when he'd only received his driver's license the morning of the kidnapping. He then goes to see Gillespie and shows him the photographs he took at the funeral, which are all terrible, but mixed in with them is the one of Mrs. Gillespie he found in the fireplace, which Gillespie probably doesn't react enough to. He shows very little emotion here, other than questioning why the photograph is there, which perhaps gives his hand away a bit too much. Columbo says he can't explain why Alvin threw it away. And again, Gillespie tips his hand too much by explaining it was a terrible composition, suggesting it was taken by a professional photographer, and Alvin was not a professional photographer. Columbo also can't understand how the newspaper was still in the room when the maid had said she cleaned the room after Alvin had left. Gillespie explains this away by saying she must have missed the room and was lying to cover herself. Too late now, though. Columbo is now asking baited questions to see how Gillespie reacts. Columbo then points out that when Gillespie did a photo series of San Quentin, where Alvin was in prison, there are photos of Alvin in his book, and he's surprised a man who deals in faces doesn't remember Alvin. Gillespie points out that maybe Alvin picked him as his next victim after his visit to San Quentin, which would be an entirely reasonable point to make, if it wasn't for the fact that Alvin wasn't a kidnapper. Columbo then contacts the DMV to find out who tested Alvin and goes to see Mr. Weekly, played by Larry Storch. Storch was born Lawrence Samuel Storch on the 8th of January 1923 in New York and attended high school with Don Adams. He then served in the US Navy in World War II on board ship with Tony Curtis. Originally a stand-up comic, he would go on to act in small roles in film and television, usually comedic, until he got his career break on the sitcom F Troop as a series regular. He would go on to star in the short-lived but well-remembered children's TV series The Ghostbusters in 1975, not to be confused with the film series of the same name. He is also an accomplished impressionist and voice actor, appearing on stage and releasing his own comedy records. He is 99. Mr. Weekly is out on a test which has broken down, and so Columbo offers to give him a lift back to the DMV. He then proceeds to terrify Mr. Weekly with his appalling driving.
Keep your eyes on the road, Lieutenant.
Oh, I'm all right,
Eyes
sir.
on
I'm
the
all right.
road.
I'm all right. Don't worry.
Watch it, watch it. Pull over.
I'm sorry, sir. No, I'm sorry.
Pull over.
But he is able to use the time to identify that Alvin did take his test the morning of the kidnapping, which really confuses Columbo, because why on earth would you plan a kidnapping on the off chance that you might have failed your driving test and have to call the whole thing off? Columbo then calls Gillespie to the station where he is working on putting together his own ransom note. He proceeds to flat out accuse Gillespie and explains why. Firstly, there was no mess in the motel room. only the newspaper with the letters missing. Either the scraps of the paper should have been there, or the newspaper shouldn't if the maid had cleaned the room. Also, the time on the clock in the kidnap photo of Mrs. Gillespie says 10 o'clock, when Alvin was taking his driving test. Columbo has had the photo blown up to show that the time says 10 o'clock, but Gillespie explains that the photo has been reversed. Has Columbo made a colossal blunder? Well, we know that Gillespie had set the time to 2 o'clock, not 10 o'clock. But no, of course Columbo hasn't made a mistake. Gillespie says Columbo just has to check the original photo to prove he couldn't have done it, but Columbo says the original was accidentally destroyed, but he was certain that it did say 10 o'clock, and asks that Gillespie is arrested. Desperate to prove his innocence, Gillespie says they don't need the original photo as they can check the negative, so he gets Alvin's camera off a shelf of cameras and Columbo has him.
Yes, this is the camera that was used to take your wife's picture. But you would have no way of knowing that. Or of knowing that this negative was in the back of this particular camera unless you'd taken the picture yourself.
This is another great episode. One of the strong 95-minuters. There are some filler scenes in there, but they either further the plot or give some genuine lightness, and crucially, don't slow down the pacing of the show. The murder plot is very solid and gives Columbo just enough to keep going as he picks away at the mistakes that the killer has made. Dick Van Dyke plays a very compelling murderer with a hint of sympathy, although not enough for you to want him to get away with it, especially with the murder of Alvin, who was genuinely trying to go straight and was completely exploited by Gillespie. It's not perfect and some of the humour isn't staged quite right, but it's close to being one of the best, and for that I give it a 4 out of 5. Thank you. Goodbye.